Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our session on how the Digital Services Act can help to curb the illegal animal trade online. This is a big issue. The large majority of cats and dogs, but also other animals as exotic wildlife, are sold online from cross-border illegal trade. And their lucrative trade is booming, especially now during the pandemic when people spend lots of time at home and are craving for company. The need for a puppy or a kitten can be very quickly satisfied via online platforms and social media where animals are advertised. With limited requirements in place, poor enforcement and anonymity, it is easy for the market participants to acquire and sell animals regardless of their origin, putting animal health and welfare, human health and public finances at risk and fueling criminal activity. The annual trade value of pet trade in Europe is estimated in billions of euros. And today we will hear more about this huge problem, and we will discuss what we can do to raise this in the legislative report on the Digital Services Act. This act is currently being prepared by the Committee on Internal Market and Consumer Protection and several opinion-giving committees. But before we start, I want to highlight that today the animal health law finally came into force. This new EU legislation that has been frequently debated in this intergroup is a cornerstone, not only for regulating transmissible diseases, but also providing specific tools to better protect animals in the EU. If it is well enforced by the member states, it will help to fight the illegal pet trade with rules on the identification and registration of pet animals. It will foster responsible dog and cat population management. It will limit live transport, allowing for species-specific intra-union journey times. It can suspend or stop fur farming in case of emergent diseases, as we now see with COVID-19, and set rules on the means and methods of equine identification. And I hope that this new framework law, which this intergroup contributed to shape, will positively deliver on animal welfare in the EU. But before I give the floor now to our speakers, let me share some, as usual, some quick housekeeping rules. This meeting is streamed live on Facebook. There is no interpretation, so all those who wish to intervene, please speak in English. Please keep yourself muted during the meeting and add your questions using the Q&A function. They will be addressed at the end of each presentation, which will be moderated by Reineke Hameliers. If you are an MEP and wish to take the floor, please let us know using the chat box or raise your hand if the function is available to you. The webinar is also recorded. The video recording and presentations will be published on the Intergroup website after this session. I would now like to introduce our first two speakers, Dr. Jennifer Maher from the University of South Wales and Mr. Paolo Zucca from Biocrime, who will provide us with information on the trading of animals as an organized crime. We will hear and see who are the winners and who are the losers of the illegal trade of animals online. Dr. Maher and Mr. Zucca, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yes, it's perfect.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so good morning. The trade in wildlife and companion animals is a lucrative and buoyant trade in the EU, with half of European households owning a pet, which includes up to 7,000 different species. The pet industry and trade alone is worth several tens of billions of euros annually. So I've conducted research on both the illegal wildlife and the illegal puppy trades in the UK. And in doing so, I've had to look at this within the European context, as they are international trades. I will very briefly identify the nature and the scope of these trades and position them as online and organised crimes. As awareness of the wildlife trade has grown substantially in the past decade, I'm going to focus most of my examples on the puppy trade, which is commonly less understood. It's important to note that there are three types of trade in both the wildlife and puppy trade. You've got the regulated trade, so for example, regulated by CITES or a Ballier directive, the legal unregulated trade, so trade that's below the threshold of regulation or not protected trade, and then the illegal trade, so that contravenes the regulations in place. And while there's some reliable data on the legal trades, more so wildlife than puppies, it is very difficult to estimate the legal unregulated trade and the illegal trades. What I provide are estimates, which hopefully will help illuminate this dark figure, but they are just that, estimates. We don't have accurate information. So an estimated 8 million puppies are required to satisfy demand in the EU, worth approximately 1 billion euros annually. The trade has grown substantially in the last decade with four, I think, very important developments. First, the development of large-scale breeding establishments, both nationally and internationally, and the development of international commercial breeders. It is notable the discrepancies and traces, for example, of the official trade and the trade that is actually known to take place. So, for example, in my research, one example given by an Irish NGO was that on traces, they identified 3,000 dogs being traded between the UK and Ireland, while they were able to follow 52,000 dogs. A second part is the increase in consumer demand for desirable and fashionable breeds, which I will come back to later on in the presentation. There's also been a growth in sales from online advertisements, and our study and that of key NGOs in the UK have identified that the online trade now dominates the puppy trade in the UK. From our study, we had a conservative estimate of the online trade being worth around £130,000, with many of the advertisements non-compliant with the regulations or with best practice. There's also an increase in the profits of the trade, and obviously it is low risk for the people who are engaging in it in an illegal fashion. In terms of the wildlife trade, we know that the EU is a major point of transit and demand for the wildlife trade. Thereby, it plays a significant role in the tens to hundreds of billions of illegal trade worldwide. A portion of the illegal trade, suggested to be a very small portion, is evident in the significant numbers of seizures that are recorded annually across the EU. And it is important to note that when we talk about seizures, each one of these seizures could represent 12 rock iguanas or 500 turtles. So they don't truly give you a kind of sense of the scale of the illegal trade in the EU. The trade has grown substantially, again, with increased consumer demand for wildlife products that permeate all aspects of our lives, including desire for exotic pets. Much of the trade is facilitated online. There's been clear movement of serious and organised crime groups who specialise or diversify into this trade. And of course, again, it provides substantial profits with very little risk. And essentially, for either the illegal wildlife or puppy trades to occur, there must be a motivated offender, there must be vulnerable victims, and there must be the absence of a capable guardian. And again, I will come back to this now shortly. In terms of linking these trades to online and organised crime, there's now considerable evidence and recognition of the role of organised crime groups in the wildlife trade, as I've mentioned. The organised nature of the puppy trade has been recognised in the UK since 2015. Although it's important to note that while my research did not specifically identify organised crime groups in the trade, essentially we need more research to be able to do this, the factors shaping European organised crime are clearly evident in the puppy trade. Specifically, I would point to the scale and transnational nature of the trade. So one example of a prosecution in the UK, 5 people illegally importing over 5,000 dogs, estimated to have made more than £2.5 million in doing so. And I have many other examples of how lucrative this trade can be for those involved in it illegally. There are diverse and multiple players, from legitimate business people to opportunistic offenders. It's a very flexible trade with a very complex modus operandi using legitimate trade routes and processes. And we can clearly see that fraud and tax evasion are a key part of the trade. So the HMRC in the UK, for example, set up a special task force on the puppy trade, and over a 4-year period reclaimed over £5 million in taxes. The reason why the internet facilitates the illegal trade is that consumers really trust in the trade, and they believe that the trade is regulated in a fashion that it really is not. The internet makes it easy for people to access the products and animals that they want. But also the trade kind of separates the consumers from the products themselves in a way that makes it very difficult for them to see the origins of the products that, or the puppies or the animals that they're purchasing. And also, there's such a large scale of trade online now that it makes it very difficult for consumers to actually identify the legitimate or the illegitimate, or the good or the bad or the best practice trade. So essentially consumers are very confused by the trade that's available online, but they still trust in and use it as their main point of contact with the puppy trade and the illegal wildlife trade. The internet links global marketplaces, and in particular, I think it's important to note, from poor rural areas where a lot of the puppy production is now happening in Europe, to very wealthy urban areas where there's a lucrative marketplace for those puppies to be sold. So while it might cost 50 euros to breed a puppy in Eastern Europe, they can sell it in, say, France or Germany or the UK for thousands, depending on the type of dog, the color of the dog, and so on and so forth. The internet removes consumer scrutiny. They really do not see the conditions of the trade itself or the people involved in the trade. And there's very little traceability, which makes it easy for the offenders and hard for the consumers to actually do anything about how they're purchasing their animals or products. In terms of the impact of the trade, I'm not going to go into this in kind of any detail, because I'm sure you're aware of the considerable and terrible consequences for the animals at all points of the trade, and also the considerable harms to consumers, the public more generally, and to the economy and national security and safety. But while you are probably aware of the continuous growth of the wildlife trade, you might not be aware of the surging consumer demand in puppies in the UK and elsewhere across Europe during the COVID pandemic. So you can see here with the graph, the increase in the price of puppies as a result of the increased demand and the kind of that which the supply can't keep up with. Unfortunately, this has created further conditions for an even more lucrative illegal puppy trade, and the consequences are yet to be understood of this. So in conclusion, the EU trade in animals is buoyant, lucrative, but also a very harmful trade. The growth in online advertisements has created a fluid trade from the urban to or from the rural to the urban, from poor areas to wealthy marketplaces. Consumers trust in the trade for their purchases, but the protection that they expect does not yet exist. Failure to regulate the trade online appropriately facilitates the illegal trade. It exposes consumers to illegal and organised crime, and it also sadly facilitates very irresponsible purchasing by consumers. Regulation of the trade through the Digital Services Act, for example, can establish a capable guardian and reduce the vulnerability of the consumer and, of course, the animals involved. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Maher. Mr. Zuka, do you have something to add to that?
Well, there are so many things. If you want, I can share and start my presentation, and then we can discuss the different topics, because if you agree.
Yes, of course. Go ahead.
Can you see the presentation? Can you hear me?
It's
Perfect.
perfect. Yes.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm speaking on behalf of the Biocrime Project. That is a project between Friuli Venezia Giulia region, Northeast Italy, and Carinthia, Austria. It's a public network of public institutions, regions, law enforcement, health units, and also justice. The first important thing to underline is related to the kind of crime we are going to deal with. We are speaking about organized crime. And second, it's very important to underline that the illegal pet trade, the illegal wildlife trade is not only bringing illegally animals in Europe, but we are also bringing diseases, and this is a huge problem at present. I'm presenting data. We are collecting data since 2017. We are located in this area of Europe, and basically you can see on the right side of the slide of the European map, the origin, the country of origin of the illegal trade, according to the information that we are collecting. And on the other side, the country of destination. But many of them can be also transit and transit route countries. So the picture is not very simple, but what I would like to underline is that more than 50% of the illegal pet and wildlife trade has no document at all. Animals are traveling without any document, and only 30% of the puppies are vaccinated against rabies. And this can give you immediately the terrible picture from the health point of view. What is the main effect of selling online wildlife and pet animals? Well, what we saw since 2017 is that the online illegal pet trade strongly affected the way with which criminals organizations deliver and transport animals. In 2017, the ratio between trucks with a large number of animals transported was about 80% for trucks and 20% for cars. In 3 years, due to the phenomena that is called fragmentation, because people are simply placing the order like they do with Amazon, they do with the illegal market of animals, they place the order online. And this is changing dramatically the way with which they deliver and transport the animals, because we have very few trucks and a lot of cars. This is a huge problem for law enforcement and veterinary officers, because it's very difficult to catch puppies that are transported in a car rather than stop a truck. This is a list of the 5 most important negative effects of illegal animal trade. As you can see, the first one is human health, zoonosis, diseases that are bringing into our countries. The second one is animal health and welfare, of course. The third one is the market protection. We are completely losing our biodiversity of the pet animal breeds that are typical of each countries. And this is a huge damage also from the genetic point of view. We have the problem of consumer fraud. And last but not least, we have the problem of bioterrorism. Why is so important the point related to health, human and animal? Because most of the diseases that are affecting humans come from animals, more than 70%. And this is the reason for which we have always to keep in mind this important aspect. We spent 3 years doing a survey in 6 countries, Italy, Austria, Germany, Slovenia, and 2 non-member states, Mauritius and Japan, to see what was the level of knowledge, the awareness, the understanding of biological risk by our adolescents. And what we found is that more than 30% of students don't know anything at all about biological risk and related risk to zoonosis and also illegal animal trade. So we should improve also, as a first step, education. Another important point and aspect is the risk of bioterrorism. We never know, whenever a pathogen enters in a country, if the introduction is deliberate, accidental, or natural. But this makes no difference for the country because the damage is huge. The picture that you can see on the top right of the slide, it's a truck with 3,000 infected parrots with Chlamydia psittaci, that is a zoonotic biosafety agent class 3 like COVID-19. It has an aerial transmission, and the best epidemiological model, if the animals are sold on the market, could be an economical loss for the region of about 35 million with 150 deaths, and the worst one could be 420 million euro and 1,800 deaths. The total value of the vehicle plus the animal was less than 5,000 euros. And so this gives you an idea of how risky is this kind of illegal trade for our society. Again, it's happening something that we don't understand. For instance, we found that a car with 3 people left from China, traveled through Siberia, and after 15 days arrived in Italy for selling 5 puppy dogs. And again, somebody is flying from Korea to Italy for selling 1 or 2 puppy. As you can understand, there is no reason, no economical reason for such kind of criminal behavior, because there is something in the backstage that we don't know. But again, we have to keep an eye on what is happening. What we can do with our project, we develop an easy model that can be replicated all over Europe because it's not expensive. You are using the original existing architecture. We are simply using the international police and cooperation centers. There are 43 centers distributed all over Europe, and we increase the cooperation between veterinary, public health, justice, law enforcement, and we use the international police and cooperation centers as a link at cross-border level. So the model can be easily replicated. You can find more information on Frontiers. We publish a paper about this. But what we think is not only that it's important to replicate the model, but we really hope that in a short future, we will be able to identify a central EU agency task force that coordinate this kind of activity. This is my last slide. What I would like to underline is that illegal pet and wildlife trade is one of the most important human-generated causal factors that are causing the emergence and resurgence of new pandemics. COVID-19 pandemic is simply a symptom of a wider, larger problem related to the negative impact of human activities. We have a huge problem at present because our brain has a cognitive bias. We don't understand, we underestimate natural risk. For instance, a lot of people are thinking that all the other diseases, zoonotic diseases, are waiting their turn because now we have COVID-19. It's false. At present, for instance, we have more than 1,000 outbreaks of avian flu in Europe. Already several people died to this. Some countries are already developing vaccine and tests. So what we can do, I know that it's very difficult to be a technician, but probably it's much more difficult to be a policy maker during a pandemics, but we should work on the causal agents. We should work on the cause of the problem. And the illegal pet and wildlife trade is one of the most important causal agent of diseases, zoonotic diseases, and new pandemics. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zuka, for your presentation. We will have our main questions and debates slot after the second or third presentation, but we can take one or two pressing questions to Dr. Maher and Dr. Paulo Zuka. Reineke, are there any questions at this moment?
Yes, Anja, we have a quick question from Chris Sherwood in the Q&A, and I would like to say to everyone, if you have questions, do pop them in the Q&A, and we will come back to you after the next presentation. So a question indeed, perhaps for both of our speakers: how can one explain the coexistence of confusion and trust among consumers when it comes to the online trade? Would you be happy to elaborate on that, Paula and Jennifer? Maybe Jennifer first?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I think the puppy trade is increasingly becoming like any other trade online, in that consumers will search online for their puppy in terms of what looks like a nice, cute puppy. They'll, in some cases, search for the best deal, but that's not necessarily always the case. Consumers we spoke to kind of went for the middle range because they thought they were getting something that was going to be, in a sense, a well-bred puppy, rather than going for the cheapest. And then they kind of followed the advertisement through to try and purchase the puppy. So increasingly, the puppy trade is becoming like any other purchase. However, one of the key differences is that the puppy trade is a very emotional purchasing the puppy is a very emotional thing for consumers, which means that consumers will often engage with the advertisements and with the actual purchase itself, follow through with it, even if they've got suspicions or concerns about where that puppy is originating or the people that they're dealing with. So the confusion aspect of the trade is that now if you go online to any of the advertisement sites, there are thousands of puppies there waiting for you to look at and to identify as the one that you want. And it's very difficult for consumers to actually be able to identify which ones are the good ones and which ones are the bad ones, because they don't understand regulations that are in place with regard to online advertisements. They don't understand how those would apply to their purchasing of the puppy. And then also consumers are obviously so used to purchasing things online that they kind of believe that whatever they do purchase online is going to be kind of done in the appropriate way. So they could only be advertised online if there was something in place to kind of regulate and ensure that the trade is appropriate. So you've got those two contrasting features. Consumers are overwhelmed by how many puppies are available, but they're also used to using the online services to purchase things, so they trust in that process.
Thank you, Jennifer. And does that then mean, Paolo, that we need to better protect consumers? Would you also see that as one of the key solutions here?
Yes, I think that the keywords are increasing control and increasing education, because it's very difficult to, as Jennifer said, to identify the good and the bad seller. But according to the idea that we have to solve the problem, we have to follow the money. We have to keep in mind, if we don't do something, also the honest breeder will be out of the market, because they cannot compete with the prices of the animals that come from the illegal animal trade. So the keywords are increase control, coordinate controls also online, and especially online, and educate starting from schools.
Very good. Thank you so much, both. We will come back to you later with more questions. But Anja, I think it's time for our third speaker.
Yes, thank you, Reineke. Yes, I have now the pleasure to present you Georgia Diamantopoulou. She is EU Companion Animal Policy Coordinator at Four Paws Europe Policy Office. And she will tell us more about the opportunities that the new Commission proposal for Digital Services Act could provide to better regulate the online trade of animals. Georgia, please take the floor.
Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen with you. You can all see my screen, right?
Yes, perfect. Go ahead.
Thank you. Indeed, as said, I will be speaking on behalf of Forpos. When it comes to companion animals, we have been investigating the illegal trade for more than 10 years now, looking into how trafficking networks operate and how they use regulatory gaps to trade cross-border. As it was already covered by previous speakers, the pet trade has also moved online like most markets. Platforms are easily accessible, very convenient to use, and give the range of options to consumers, an unprecedented one, that they can choose from. According to research, up to 438,000 dogs and 80,000 cats are advertised for sale online at any given moment in the EU. But we have identified two major problems with this. First is it is really impossible to differentiate between the animals that are healthy and come from a caring, responsible environment, and those that were bred illegally, potentially imported to be sold underage, sick, and unvaccinated. The second problem is that anyone, literally anyone, can advertise online. So on the one hand, we see the legally operating breeders and the sellers that are regulated, including under the animal health law. Then we have the small-scale hobby breeders that member states have chosen to not regulate. Then we have the sellers, of course, who try to rehome pets. But on the other hand, we have the advertisements that come from unregulated breeders, backyard breeders, third-party sellers, and it's very likely that all these people operate in breach of national and European legislation. So we have seen that online platforms are really the preferred channel to the market for illegal sellers. And this is due to the limited regulation in place, most notably the lack of a requirement to verify the identity of sellers, which obviously allows them to advertise in complete anonymity. Then the large number of advertisements, together with the methods that are deployed by sellers, really make it very hard to moderate content and eventually detect fraud. Despite some platforms having introduced mandatory requirements for sellers, the information submitted is really rarely verified. And finally, platforms give access to such a big audience of potential buyers, which essentially secures fast sales. As such, platforms really unwittingly become a very handy tool for illegal traders. And obviously, this has severe implications, as also said by previous speakers, which include a high level of consumer deception, with new owners ending up with a sick or dying animal, high veterinary costs, and little protection of the rights. Then we have the risk of zoonotic disease like rabies and parvo and so on. This is even more severe since it's impossible to trace the animal back to its breeder. And obviously governments are losing large sums of tax revenue. The single market is compromised with unfair competition, with responsible breeders unable to keep up, and illegal sellers very often enjoying profit margins of up to 75% on single sales. And finally, the trade is responsible for tremendous animal suffering, with animals bred and kept in the most unsanitary, really horrendous conditions just to keep the costs as low as possible and eventually boost revenues. So, as a matter of fact, let's put this to the test. I would like you to take a moment to look at this advertisement. And at first glance, it looks fine, complete. We see a lot of information submitted by the seller, which should, well, eventually boost consumers' trust in it. We see it includes the microchip number of the puppy and the microchip number of the mother as well, but also the registration number of the breeder, which we have blurred for previous reasons. However, while the country in which the advertisement is posted mandates that all dogs are microchipped and that this microchip number is registered in a database together with information on the owner, just a quick search online shows that neither the chip number of the puppy nor that of the mother are registered in the National Animal Database. So obviously, this indicates illegal activity and implies that the dog is not registered under a seller that could be held accountable in case of mis-sell or any other issues that might emerge. So we also see the breeder's number, that it's included. However, by no means does this guarantee legitimacy of the advertisement, since the national list of authorized breeders in this country is public, and therefore the information could have been simply copied. So the COVID-19 outbreak also had a tremendous impact on trade. During the first lockdown, advertisements really dropped, despite the rising demand in puppies particularly, which in some countries soared up to 115% compared to previous figures. Here we see how the advertisements for puppies went down over the past year on 2 large websites in Germany. So the travel restrictions that were introduced for individuals seem to have coincided with a drop by 67% on the number of puppy ads, which means, kind of implies that many dogs come from abroad, but most important, that these animals might as well be transported non-commercially and therefore in breach of EU legislation. So online platforms are obviously becoming increasingly aware of this matter, and some are taking measures to address it. However, we see that these are not effective in improving traceability of sellers or discouraging fraud. So we see that most platforms rely on email verification to validate the information submitted by the seller on his identity. But we know that traders really use various email accounts to advertise under numerous profiles. Just to take an example, we know of an Irish breeder who has 28 contact numbers, and a seller in the Netherlands who uses 33 different online profiles, one for each breed he sells on an online marketplace. So obviously sellers can delete their profile at any time, which in practice means that a seller may be already offline by the time the animal shows the first symptoms of unwellness. Then other measures include mandatory fields like the microchip number and breeder number. The problem is, as we've seen, that this information is almost never validated. Some platforms ask for breeder certificate, which they can check manually, but it is of course easy for one to claim that he's in one of seller or a hobby breeder that does not hold the necessary permits and still complies with national legislation. Then a paywall for pet sales was recently introduced by a few marketplaces, but user experience shows us that this is still very hard for the authorities to access the identity information via the transaction code, especially when we're speaking about individual cases. So some marketplaces have, of course, updated their terms of use to raise awareness, but it is obviously getting increasingly complex to detect fraud. And finally, when it comes to social media, this is a completely different world, and closed groups are really rife with illegal offers of animals. Nonetheless, we should acknowledge that there are some platforms that are very conscious of the role they play and that they're committed to their responsibility towards the markets and the consumers that they serve. Just a few examples of these platforms are Anibis, eDogs, Dogs, IE, Dynatirvelt, and OLX. And we have seen that the EU and member states have been also made aware of the high level of incompliance on the online pet trade quite recently through the EU Coordinated Control Plan on online sales of dogs and cats, whose outcomes show offers of trafficked and underage animals, unvaccinated or sick, with fake documents and a serious mismatch between the seller's status and actual volume of activity. Just to add to that, the EU platform on animal welfare has recently endorsed a set of guidelines for online platforms and for consumers that was produced by the pet trade subgroup, aiming to improve traceability in the sector. And also some member states have introduced a level of requirements to sell online, while 2 expert workshops endorsed by the Austrian and Croatian presidencies of the councils respectively acknowledged the need for better traceability of sellers and of animals in the online trade. This was also mirrored in the expert report Game Over, which showed that more than 90% of participants in the workshops, including stakeholders from the institutions and from member states, believe that online platforms should be responsible for verifying sellers' information and that only registered pets should be made available for sale. So we see the Digital Services Act as really a great opportunity that provides a good framework for better protection in the online trade. Of course, we're encouraged by the principles, the Know Your Business Partner principle, and what is illegal offline is also illegal online principle. We trust that the DSA should be more ambitious to effectively address and eventually tackle seller anonymity and expand its scope as to include the illegal pet trade. We therefore see that it should be strengthened with a mandatory requirement to verify the identification information of the seller and also of the product by using interfaces that can check against any databases that are made available from all possible stakeholders, competent authorities of member states, and so on. We are convinced that this should be able to send a really clear message on the EU's intentions and commitment to address the illegal trade, hold sellers accountable, and eventually discourage fraud. This should contribute to the establishment of a level playing field in the sector and in the advertisement of companion animals online. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Georgia. It has certainly given us food for thought. I would now like to open the floor for questions and debate. And I go over to Reineke. Are there any questions at this moment?
Yes, Anja, we have some questions. And firstly, I would like to ask that question to Georgia. Georgia, you showed a lot of bad practices and issues and also opportunities now. Could you elaborate a bit on the role of identification and registration and how the new animal health law that came into effect today, as we just heard, can play a role in improving that? And how could that work in practice?
So we're obviously very happy with the way the animal health law evolves. However, we think that registration of breeders and sellers is like a fine step, but it could go further. So we would really expect to see a delegated act on identification and registration to establish harmonized standards for the microchipping and registration of companion animals all over the EU. And this could really serve as an amazing tool for seller traceability, including online. So registration databases could play a major role as outlets for cross-checking basically the validity of information submitted by sellers that want to advertise animals online. So the DSA speaks a lot about interfaces. One of these interfaces could, eventually connect the platform to the registration database in the member state or to an overarching reference registry that gives access to many databases across the EU, and through a fully GDPR compliant process that essentially involves the animal's microchip number and some contact information, let's say, on the advertiser, the platform should know that the dog is registered, and it's registered under the name of a traceable, therefore accountable seller. And they should be able this way to offer their audience with safe products. And yes, this is something that's definitely possible. We hope to see it in the upcoming future.
Yeah, for sure. And Georgia, does that mean that there will then be a European database, or as you said, there will be an interface connecting all the regional and national databases? Because there seems to be a bit of confusion there.
So a fair level of the required infrastructure is already in place through EuroPetNet. EuroPetNet is a group of registration databases that puts together around 50% of the databases currently operating in the EU. And it has a really long experience in pet ownership reunification and operates a central, let's say, search tool that is able to tell at any given moment at which database and in which member state an animal is registered at. So obviously the Commission should explore EuroPetNet as, you know, a model that provides for pet traceability and for owner traceability, and then try to connect this reference registry, EuroPetNet, with online platforms, just to be able to verify the identity of sellers and animals that are sold online.
That sounds like a very good solution, Georgia. And how would that work for breeders and sellers in countries outside the EU? Could they then also still submit their animals in this system?
Absolutely. EuroPetNet is also open to third countries. But at the end of the day, it really depends on the platforms, and it really depends what sort of animals they want to, well, offer their services at. They are the ones granting access to traders and to the advertised animals. So if they say that they only want registered animals to be advertised, this can be very easily included in their terms and conditions. And through the use of this interface, if you want, this application programming interface, they should be able to verify the identity of the seller and of the advertised animal even before the advertisement goes online. And this is a very good level of safety.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Then we have another question from Joanna in the Q&A. And I think this question is relevant to all our speakers. How about the trade of stray dogs? We know that a lot is going on there too, and that stray dogs are legally or illegally transported from countries such as Portugal to other EU countries. Do you also see issues there, and should this trade also be included whilst looking at the solutions? Can I invite Paolo to comment first on this, please?
Yes, thanks. This is a really good question, because this is a new trendy criminal activity. We have experienced and confiscated in Italy and also in Austria, excuse me, several times dogs belonging to false NGOs. They are collecting stray dogs and also stealing dogs all over Europe for selling to other NGOs, asking for donation. But if you transport 40 dogs and you ask 200-300 euros for each dog as a donation, you're able to make a lot of money on a weekly basis. So this is the new frontiers of criminal illegal pet trade in Europe. We recently confiscated, by the way, in Italy and also in Austria, dogs from with passport from Greece, Malta, Finland, Norway, Germany, wherever. So the animals usually don't have any value on the market, but if you sell them from illegal to legal NGOs, this makes the difference in terms of criminal activity.
Yes, indeed. Very good that you flagged this. I wonder, Jennifer, would you like to add something to that? Have you also looked into this part of the trade, this extra dimension?
Yes, our study didn't specifically look at this, but in the consumers we spoke to, this was identified as one aspect or one way in which people got hold of their dogs. And actually adopting rather than purchasing, so the people who think about these dogs or think of taking on these dogs are usually adopting them rather than seeing it as a purchase. They very much see it as a badge of honor. So within the UK, if you have a rescue dog from abroad, it does give you a certain kind of status. So we are seeing an increase in these type of dogs coming into the country. And of course, there's concerns amongst NGOs with regard to zoonotic diseases and animal health in the country and how that might be impacted by these dogs. But also recognition that NGOs are being set up, as Paolo identified, in these countries, and then the dogs have been brought to the UK, and of course a donation is being asked for, but those donations can be quite considerable, and you do not know whose hands that money is going into. So very much kind of reflecting in what Paolo said, kind of similar concerns in the UK.
Thank you, Jennifer. And can I ask you another question also linked to the situation in the UK now? Have you seen a drop in imports now Brexit has come into effect? Because that was always the idea that now there are more controls at the border, that this illegal trade would diminish.
So it's not straightforward in terms of getting hold of that information, but what I can say is that when the borders closed for kind of general movement due to COVID, there was a sharp decline in dogs being brought into the UK as pets, so through the pet passport scheme. And there was an increase then in the commercial movement of dogs. So it points to what Georgia said with regard to clearly the pets scheme was being used by a lot of people to bring dogs illegally into the country. With regard to what's happened at the border since Brexit, I don't think the conditions have, as in there's obviously a lot of further work that needs to be done now at the ports in terms of checks of various products. And I don't think dogs are being identified as necessarily a priority at those borders. But as I said, it's still a bit too early to be able to identify whether the change at the borders has been a positive or a negative kind of impact on the puppy trade. But at least in terms of consumer demand and in terms of sales in the UK, we are not seeing a decline in that. So clearly consumers are still very keen and very competitive now with regard to getting hold of their puppies. And the supply seems to be kind of keeping up with it, although not quite to the level of demand as far as we're concerned, hence the significant increase in the price of a lot of these fashionable puppies.
Yeah, that's interesting what you were saying, because Georgia told us that the profit margins of the illegal trade are really high, 75%. Do you think that if we were to really tackle the illegal trade, that this cross-border movement would decline, that it would become a lot less profitable to transport these animals over such long distances, even if legal, that we would move towards a more domestic trade?
I think one of the difficulties with puppy trade is I would never want to suggest that we need to develop a more robust national trade. I think actually what we should be looking at the trade from is the perspective of trying to ensure that consumers are responsible in their purchases and in their demand for dogs or puppies or rescue kind of dogs. I think that's kind of a very important perspective to look at. Because essentially in the UK, there have been the development of large breeding establishments, and these are also problematic. And of course, within the UK, there are puppy farms and so on and so forth that are, kind of produce very poorly bred dogs. And again, there's a whole illegal enterprise around that. So of course, it's important for countries to look at their own national production of puppies, if you like, but more importantly, I think it is about ensuring that consumers are realistic about their desire and then their purchase of these animals. And because unfortunately, it is the demand that is fueling the trade. If the demand was not there and if consumers were not purchasing puppies in the way that they are online very kind of quickly without necessarily doing a lot of research, then of course it would not be a lucrative trade for the producers, whether it's legal or illegal.
Yeah, so I guess we are also looking at a mix of solutions. And I would like to zoom in a bit more on the solutions and ask Paulo to elaborate a bit on your biocrime model, because during your presentation, you didn't really have the time to share with us the results. So what are the results you have seen, and how do you think that this model could be scaled up at the EU level? And could European institutions such as Europol also draw lessons from the results of your model?
Well, of course, the model is very simple because we are not creating new structure. We are using the existing structures distributed all over Europe, and especially the international police and cooperation centers. These centers, there are 43 centers. Into the center, you can find the police and the customs of at least 2 or 3 European member states. So the idea that we had is to create the first synapses between the health network and the law enforcement networks, because it's a paradox, but these are 2 networks that are parallel, but they don't speak one each other. So we creating an office that is physically inside the International Police Center. We increase the rate of exchange information, and we gave also training to the law enforcement, because there is a huge problem in Europe. Because if you think we have a lot of attention against cyber crime, digital crime, but we don't have a biological crime agency, even if we are into the middle of a pandemic. So again, we are underestimating the biological risk. Several law enforcement are exposed every day to the biological risk that are not the CBRN, that means chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear, but they are completely different. So the solution from our point of view, I mean, it's complex, but one starting point could be to increase communication among an existing system. So you don't have to put money, you have simply to increase and put together people. Of course, we have to include also public prosecutors, because nobody can prosecute criminals if they don't understand how huge is the risk. Second, we have also to protect the internal market. I'm not pushing to increase the number of breeders, but if we don't stop the illegal pet trade, the honest breeders will disappear, because the difference in terms of money from the legal and the illegal market is so huge that you can stay on the market. So the third point on which we really think is very important is education, because not only about illegal pet trade, but against the illegal wildlife trade and biological risk and the concept of One Health. At present, we have a huge problem as humankind. We have the so-called loneliness problem. We think to be alone, but this is a really short period of our evolutionary history. It's only 30,000 years that we are alone as a species of Homo sapiens on the planet. And this is a sort of misunderstanding. We think to be special, but we are not. And the pandemic is showing us how easy it is to affect our species. So we have to think about our position in the ecosystem. Therefore, the solution against is increased cooperation, increase protection of the internal market in terms of letting people that are doing honest work to work, and protect also the genetic history of each breeds that each country has. And the last but not less important is education. Education in terms of training of law enforcement, but also our children and adolescents in schools. So we, as a project, we proposed to include in each curricula of the European school a subject about One Health, biological risk, and illegal animal trade.
That's a very clear message. Paulo, can I ask you a follow-up question to that? Do you think that the European institutions are doing enough at this moment? And where do you see the low-hanging fruit at the EU level?
I think it's, as I mentioned before during my presentation, it's very difficult to be a health technician at present, but probably is worse to be a policymaker during pandemic. So instead of saying what is not being done, I would prefer to discuss what we could do in the future, in a short future. We have to increase cooperation. I really like British quotes that say that a problem shared is a problem half solved. So if we don't share, we will lose the battle, because the organized crime are sharing properly and very efficiently information, but we are not. So the first thing is to establish and increase cooperation at cross-border level, but also creating a European agency. I cannot tell you if it will be Europol or another agency. The second step is that we should not only focusing our attention on cybercrime, but also on biological risk and biocrime. We have a European agency about cybersecurity. We are in the middle of a pandemic, and we don't have a European agency against biosecurity. The idea is that criminals, like scientists, are learning from diseases and pandemics. So it will be a problem for the future, for the next generation, to manage properly diseases, and the illegal pet and animal trade is absolutely connected with them. We will not solve one problem without taking account also the others. I don't know if I replied properly to your question, but the matter is very complex. What I would like is to have a central agency. I really would like a central agency that will facilitate the exchange of information of the cross-border units. And this is the reason for which we suggested to use the international police cooperation centers, because they already exist and they already work.
Well, I think that's definitely useful. Now we have looked at the enforcement and the control. Let us also elaborate a bit more on the online sales. Georgia, you shared with us a lot of information about the bad examples and what goes wrong. Is there also a best practice in place in terms of online sales? Do we have an online platform that has really already changed its requirements and where this is working much better?
So this is a really interesting question. Within the coming month, a pilot system will start from Ireland, which should be able to do exactly what we said before. Therefore, an online platform agreed with a pet registration database to conduct backend checks before the advertisements go live. This means that if a seller wants to submit an advertiser, he should have to submit the microchip number of the dog first, and his contact information, whether that be a mobile phone number or an email address. Then this electronic interface takes this information and checks that the dog due to be advertised is indeed registered in this registry in Ireland under the contact details indicated by the potential advertiser. And once this match is found in the registry, then and only then the ad can be green lighted. Then the advertiser receives a one-time code which is necessary to put the ad live. And this way the platform can guarantee that, no matter what happens, the dog is registered under a seller that is traceable and can be found should post-sale issues emerge. So this is a cooperation between the Irish database FIDO, which is the Europe.net member, and the platform, the classified platform Dogs.ie, which is a specialized website, for animals. So we're hoping that this system will prove that seller traceability is feasible and definitely very possible to include also in the Digital Services Act within the requirements for better seller traceability.
That's really interesting, Georgia. And can you say a bit more about the Digital Services Act and what you expect from the MEPs listening today? Because you mentioned in your presentation that you believe that this legislative act needs to be more ambitious. You also came up with some clear ideas. So what needs to happen now to make sure that these additional requirements will be included?
I think that the Parliament should really consider what they want out of this proposal. So they have the unprecedented chance to introduce seller traceability for many risk-posing activities, including the trade in animals. So I would like to see the proposal more strengthened. So not leaving the margin for online platforms to escape, let's say, the requirement for seller traceability. So everything is possible. The platforms have the tools. They should just be required to, basically use what is out there, right? And we know that they have been engaging in verification for other products, let's say cars. And obviously this is possible for animals too, because it entails all this suffering and all these hazards that we spoke about before. So seller traceability shouldn't be negotiable. Shouldn't be negotiable. It should be like a very strict requirement that eventually, let's say, endorses, supports platforms in providing for the optimal service to their users. And this is ideally what we would like to see in the proposal, strengthening of Article 22 on seller traceability.
Great. So the MEPs have a very good opportunity here to make proposals for this. Why do you think, Georgia, that this wasn't included in the Commission's proposal? Why is there so little attention to really also consider the sales of animals within the framework of digital services?
So the Digital Services Act is a horizontal regulation. It doesn't go like sector specific, but obviously whatever should apply for other products should also apply for the trade in animals. We regret to see in some parts of the proposal that by no means should this text be considered as guaranteeing, the legitimacy of the information offered to consumers. And this shouldn't be the case, because eventually it is the platforms themselves that offer access to traders and to the traded products. So as confirmed in the past by BEUC, the European Consumers Organization, consumers expect that the products that they see online, that these products are checked by someone, and if something goes wrong, that they should be able to somehow trace the product back to the seller. And this burden shouldn't be falling on the shoulders of the consumers, because it's a disproportionate one. Platforms should be responsible because they are the ones granting market access in the first place. And let's face it, consumers are in essence not sort of information. It's just far too complex for them to engage into detecting fraud. And there are tools out there that can provide for that and can also facilitate the operation of platforms in a really automated, GDPR compliant way.
Yeah, I think so. What you're saying is that platforms need to be forced to take their responsibility. And we have a very good opportunity now coming up. Linked to consumer information, there is a question from Ali van Jessen, who is asking, the pet trade is highly emotional, as Jennifer already mentioned, and that affects the impact of education. And there's a lot of information available. But what is the trigger for consumers to use that information and to also to see the wood for the trees? Jennifer, would you like to come in on that? Do you have any views on that?
I do. I think with regard to consumers, so consumers don't recognize or don't understand the wide-scale impact of these trades. And unfortunately, for example, law enforcement, other people involved or who are stakeholders in the trade often don't recognize this either, which is kind of linked to your question before as to why has this not been considered in the Digital Act. So I think the first thing is we need to ensure that consumers and any stakeholder in the trade is aware of actually the wide scale and serious implications of the trade. For example, consumers don't realize that this is a serious crime and it can be linked to serious organized crime groups. So by engaging in the trade, they're obviously facilitating not just that particular crime, but many other crimes as well. The difficulty is that changing behaviors, it's not a straightforward thing. And there have been a number of efforts in the UK and elsewhere to try and help support consumer education and awareness. But I think you're always kind of, the difficulty, I guess, with regard to the puppies or in particular exotic pets, is that when people have a desire for these things, often the scrutiny they would put in place for other purchases online, they don't put in place for these particular purchases. So that's kind of number one problem, in terms of, even if they have some education and awareness, they're not necessarily going to follow through on it with these type of emotional purchases. With regard to what we can do, as I said, there have been a number of things that have been put in place with regard to the wildlife trade and the puppy trade. But I don't think any one approach seems to be having a significant impact. So I think it's going to be a combination of different factors. So education awareness goes hand in hand with making the trade less profitable for offenders and more risky for offenders, ensuring that there are capable guardians in place, and consumers are part of that in terms of capable guardians, but also, as I said, the various other stakeholders in the trade. So it's not just going to be a one solution situation. All these things have to go hand in hand. But fortunately, they are all interrelated. So but with the Digital Services Act, that falls kind of in line with the online the registration of dogs and so on and so forth. So all these things are linked and should be looked at as a whole rather than just a single possible solution.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the good news is that the EU has now all these tools at its disposal to also make it work. I guess what's also complicated is that animals are still being described as goods and products within the framework of the Digital Services Act. Do you have any views on that, Georgia? Would that need to be changed?
I would say in an ideal world, definitely. However, in the framework of the Digital Services Act, I would say that whatever applies in terms of seller traceability and product traceability in all sorts of goods obviously should apply also on companion animals, because they're treated as such for all reasons and purposes. So I would say, as long as the Commission is able to provide a level of traceability for the traders and for the products themselves, I think we have a very good chance to address, I would say, the matter, as Jennifer said. And indeed, it touches upon like various fields, and there should be a collective effort, but definitely online platforms have a major role to play, since they are the main channel to the market for breeders and for sellers, including illegal ones of companion animals.
Thank you, Georgia. Our president, Anja, also has a question about the issues around enforcement. Anja, you will ask your question yourself.
Well, thank you very much, Reineke. Yes, it is in the presentations and your answers, you've shown that there is a huge problem with the illegal trade, and that there are huge risks involved. In the Netherlands, we have some big sellers. Georgia mentioned that one of them has 33 profiles online and is changing. House of Animals did some research on this topic, and especially into this seller. And what we noted was that thousands of puppies from Hungary are sold through this seller, with falsified passports. The animals were at a very young age. Animals are sick. And also extremely worrying is because if they are vaccinated against rabies, for instance, they are vaccinated at a too young age and the vaccine doesn't work. So the number of antibodies is too low. And even if we present these data to the law enforcers and the competent authorities, there is an absolute unwillingness enforce. And I was wondering, do you see this in other countries as well, that if you hand over all the facts and all the things that show that the cases are illegal now, how do you force them to do something about it? And do we have instruments in the Digital Services Act to tackle this and to prevent the lack of enforcement, or do we only have the infringement procedure of the European Commission?
Well, let's hope not, Anja, because we know that it wouldn't be very effective. But Georgia, I think you are the real expert to talk about the DSA. To what extent could this new legislation also tackle these enforcement issues, or are there other tools that may be more appropriate?
So obviously, we would very much like to see the requirement for identification and registration. Just because as long as we keep relying on paperwork documents like the pet passport or the traces certificates, there is always the risk of fraud. So in order to be able to ring-fence legislation in a way from routine fraud and abuse, we absolutely need to connect the animal with the transponder that it bears and the information therein that should be connected electronically with a database. This is waterproof in a way. So it's true what you said when you refer the problem oftentimes to control authorities and enforcement authorities. Either they do not assign it like the importance that they should, or they consider it far too complex to address. And indeed, it's a super complex issue. Paperwork forging is has developed into a pretty elaborate activity. So very often we see fake stickers of rabies vaccination, and the only way to actually define that these stickers are fraudulent is to track back the bunch of the vaccine all the way to the company, which is not something that is common knowledge or can be done during the official controls. So obviously, just to facilitate the work of control authorities, a scanner should be sufficient, like a reader that reads the microchip number of the animal and shows that the animal is indeed duly registered under someone, preferably the person who is transporting it for commercial purposes. Otherwise, it should be always registered under the owner. So this is the only way to secure once and for all traceability of the animal from the breeder to the trader to the owner and to all consecutive owners. And this is exactly this element is what we're trying to insert in the Digital Services Act, just to show that by requiring that platforms do the checks against registration databases, then they can at least provide for traceable dogs that are registered under someone. So all it takes is an interface that connects the platform with the database and a system that's able to say, you know what, the dog that's about to be registered is that's about to be advertised is duly registered under the advertiser. And this is an element of traceability that the Digital Services Act could include. By asking from platforms to exhaust their options and basically verify the identity information against all available databases out there, including pet registration databases.
Thank you, Georgia. So what you're saying is that the Digital Services Act could require this, but then we also need the delegated act under the animal health law to put it in place, right? To make sure that we have this harmonized approach in terms of INR. Paulo, would you like to come in on this?
Yes, thanks. I would like to say something more to reply to the question of Enya. First of all, about rabies vaccination, what you can do. The level and the complexity of falsification of the sticks is so high and so sophisticated that also the producing companies sometimes could take 1 or 2 months to tell you if the stick is real or false. The general and the basic thing that you can do immediately is to teach to veterinary officer and law enforcement how to write a proper report to the justice and the public prosecutors, because there is already an existing legislation in European Community that works. And whenever you explain that if you introduce illegally in the country a puppy that is not properly rabies vaccinated, you can create a damage from the region that could be from 1 to 10,000 million euros. That is enough, because whenever you mention money, then things go faster, because then the first step is to learn to write properly an official report. The second one that I would like to mention, the second topic is related to the microchip and transponders. I think that what said Georgia is very important, absolutely. But as far as we know, new technologies are able to falsify directly the number of the microchip or transponder, as you want to call it, when it is already implanted into the dogs. Okay, so the idea is that we also have to reduce and to increase the control of the subjects that can inoculate, transponder, and record the first entering database into the data bank about the recording of animals, because we confiscated several times trucks with several kinds of transponders belonging to different European nationalities. That means that criminals can choose what is the nation from which the animal comes from. So the idea is that the technology that stays in the backstage of identification of the animal can be falsified due to the advancements in the management of the transponders. So we have to increase our control and to involve more veterinary officers, but also veterinary practitioners, and the companies should sell the transponders only to these professionals and not to the market or to the private breeders. This is something that is really affecting negatively the identification traceability of the animals.
Thank you, Paolo. And that is currently allowed for companies to also sell the transporters to other agents than veterinarians. Jennifer, you would like to come in on this?
Yeah, sorry, just coming in on the point more generally, I think it's very important that we recognize that with the offenders, how extremely flexible and capable they are of changing their behavior and processes in response to increased regulation. So I absolutely agree with Paolo with regard to traceability is key, collaboration is key, and intelligence is key across the board. In particular, I think one of the big issues with regard to anything that's kind of in place at the moment or put place in the future is to ensure that there are resources in place for enforcement. So as you know, it's one thing to put regulations in place, it's another thing to ensure that they're actually enforced and enforced in an appropriate manner to ensure that it becomes a much riskier place for criminals to be active. So in the UK, we've had, for example, with online advertisements, there are regulations in place, but what we identified was that there was no one in terms of those who were meant to be kind of enforcing that area. No one was really checking it and ensuring that the regulation was taking place, but also that there was a lot of responsibility put on the platforms, online platforms themselves to self-regulate. And again, this was identified as problematic in terms of they did to a certain degree, but not across the board. And therefore there were a lot of loopholes and easy access for criminals to the marketplace. And also linked to this is the empowerment of consumers, that though the consumers, where possible, need to be provided with the information to check and ensure the purchase themselves. So it's one thing agencies and organizations having it, but with the limited resources they have, we also have to empower consumers to have that information on some level or scale with regard to traceability, with regard to licensing and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of layers and a lot of players in terms of how to put a much more robust system in place to ensure that the illegal trade does not take place. And again, I point to many different things need to happen rather than just one quick fix or answer.
Yes, and there's also really points to the fact that we need holistic solutions. going forward. Anja, we heard a lot about the importance of traceability, about holding platforms to account, much stronger enforcement efforts, collaboration. So yeah, I think, you know, the problems are huge, but the solutions are there. And technology can also help us to a great extent here. So I would like to hand back to you and to share with us your conclusions and your closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Reineke. We have seen today that the illegal pet trade is a problem of all EU member states, and that only an EU-wide solution will be able to address this. And the 2021-2025 EU strategy to tackle organized crime confirmed the seriousness of the illegal trade as organized crime. The new proposal for a Digital Services Act gives us the unique opportunity to take the relevant initiatives that EU citizens expect to be translated in EU legislation. The Digital Services Act can help to curb the illegal animal trade online and make the online purchase of animals safer for the European consumer by addressing the following 5 points. One is recognizing the illegally traded animals. 2 is to introduce an effective due diligence process for advertisement approval. 3 is to apply a proactive verification process of information to disable publications known to be false or misleading, and finally to ensure a legal framework that is fit for long-term challenges and technological developments. And these views are very much in line with consumer interests and consumer organization positions. And I am confident that our colleagues in the IMCO committee will introduce wording to the Commission proposal aimed at better protecting the health and welfare of traded pets, consumer rights, and public health. And once again, a coordinated cross-party approach will be necessary to achieve the set of objectives. And there, of course, the help of all members of this intergroup is much needed and much appreciated. To conclude, I want to inform you that next week on Wednesday, 28th of April, from 3 to 3:45, the Animal Welfare Intergroup will have an exchange of views with Commissioner Stella Kyriakides. She is Commissioner for Health and Food Safety, and she will present the outcome of the evaluation of the EU Animal Welfare Strategy 2012-2015. That's a long time ago. And as you will know, this is one of the documents that the Commission has foreseen for the fitness check of the animal welfare related legislation and policy. This meeting with the Commissioner will allow us to ask questions and to get more details about upcoming policy developments in the frame of the fitness check. So I invite all of you to join this meeting next week. So let's close this meeting. Have a great day and hope to see you soon again. Bye.